The inside of the throne room. Oh, sorry, I also wanted to point this out too. You'll notice, in addition to these tribute bearers, right, bringing exotic goods, bringing animals such as monkeys and oils, there's an inscription that runs across each of these panels. And on each case, the inscription is the same. You can see it here, also here. And this is known as the standard inscription. And the reason for that is it's the same inscription over and over and over again. And what it is a retelling and a rehashing of a lot of the same information that we see in the banquet stele. Holds a lot of information about the genealogy of Ashurnasirpal II, giving his right to rule, talking about his titles and, of course, his deeds, the people that he conquered, the temples that he built, and the establishment of Nimrud as a capital. So, again, a combination not just of iconography, but also of text, right? The two laid one on top of the other, really just making it very, very clear what this new Assyrian ideology is all about. The carved orthostats that we see on the outside of the throne room continue inside as well. And this throne room being the center of the palace, which is the center of Nimrud, which is the center of the imperial empire, it's really a microcosm of really what Assyria is all about. We should note too that we look at these reliefs. They would have been very vividly painted, as Ashurnasirpal tells us himself, right? That he painted these with vivid blues and colors, very similar to Greek sculpture. So we look at these and we think, oh, they're very sort of stark and colorless, but in the past they would have been quite bright and almost garish. The reliefs inside the throne room move towards the end. The throne again would have been right here, and one would have approached the king again in a bent axis approach, right, coming through this center portico between the lamassu and then turning to your right, and you would have faced the king. And all of these sculptural reliefs, as you can see here, run up the sides of the throne room, leading you to the center of the throne room and the king himself. We see these progressions actually it's very interesting actually. If we look at the reliefs, there are actually two axes in which all of these figures who are progressing meet, and two identical compositions, one here and one here. You can see this guy, right, which is here, and then this guy, which is here. It's the same scene of these figures progressing towards a central axis, which is symmetrical, with the king on both sides, flanked by these winged geniuses. They're often called geniuses in literature. They're known as Apkallu figures. They're divinities that assist the king, these minor divinities. So this scene is actually depicted twice. And you would see it on entering the throne room, right? It would be right here. And then again, as you turn to the right and face the king, you would see it again behind the king himself. So a very intentional symmetry in the way that these images are portrayed and what you would see as you enter. Should look at this sacred tree in a little bit more depth. Just as these Apkallu figures, just as these lamassu figures are composite creatures combining elements of birds and bulls and human beings, so too do we see it in this sacred tree. It's also interesting to note that the sacred tree, while it's a composite tree, it's a mythical tree, perhaps linked to fertility and the fertility of the land itself. These palmettes run the exterior, and the center of it also seems to be a palm tree. And we saw the significance of palm trees as early as Mari, right? Palm trees being linked to fertility because they are actually both male and female. You have to fertilize palm trees in order for them to produce dates and in order for them to produce fruit. And actually, this is probably what these Apkallu are doing. You can see they're holding a bucket here, and they've got this pine cone, which they're sort of reaching forward. In other scenes, we actually see them touching this pine cone to the palmettes. So it's thought that perhaps this is the process of fertilizing these palm trees. And indeed, a process like this actually continues to this day in the Middle East, in places like Iraq, where palms are harvested. You actually go from palm to palm, fertilizing it with a bucket that's filled with pollen. So again, this is probably what is being symbolized here. Again, on a much grander scale, right? This is the fertility of the entire empire. But this is what this scene is sort of alluding to. Oh, and actually, you can see this in a little bit more depth here. Here's both the palm, right? An example of that cone being touched to the palmettes in other reliefs at Nimrud. And it's interesting, if you look at the bucket that these Apkallu are actually carrying, if you zoom in on it, you'll see that these buckets are self-referential, right? There are the Apkallu again touching the cone to the palmettes. So just in case you missed it, right, these Assyrian sculptors are making it very, very, very clear what is going on here. All right. The combination of text in the standard inscription, which talks about the deeds of the king, the strength of the king, and then the images themselves, right? They mutually reinforce one another. Again, keep in mind, many people couldn't read at this time, so if you can't read the inscription, then you're really going to get it from the images. And in terms of the strength of the king, his ability to, sort of dominate the natural world and the world of man, really come as you get closer to the throne itself. And what we see here are a series of hunting scenes. Again, the king is said to be as strong as wild bulls and lions. Well, here he is actually running over bulls. He's running over lions. He's hunting them. And lion hunt scenes, of course, right, the significance isn't lost on us. We've seen lion hunt scenes, from the very beginning, from Uruk, right? And there's actually a ritual aspect to this too. In other scenes, we see Ashurnasirpal actually pouring libations over the bodies of these dead lions, in a way symbolically kind of appropriating their power, sacrificing them to gods and goddesses. And we'll see lion hunt scenes later on with the Assyrians too, when we get to Ashurbanipal a little bit later in the semester. But again, this image of the king conquering nature becomes very, very clear. Hand in hand, in addition to conquering nature, we also see scenes of conquest of cities. And these are very, very interesting because the Assyrians are, again, very good at depicting, like the Egyptians, very good at depicting foreigners in terms of their dress, in terms of their hairstyle, in terms of the way that they would be. So if you're a foreigner and you're coming to the Assyrian palace, you're actually looking at images of your countrymen who have probably been captured, have probably been brought under the yoke of the Assyrian Empire, and you're seeing them, you're seeing yourself displayed in this very particular way. Perhaps your own city being sacked, such is the case with this relief here, also coming from the throne room. And these are really fascinating for a number of reasons. We talked about advances in warfare. Anybody want to take a stab at what's going on in this scene? Yeah.
They're digging a tunnel under the wall.
Almost. We will see that because we've seen sappers. That was one way to take a city, right? That's why the Hittites built those glacis all around the city to keep people from digging under. They're not quite digging. I'll give you a hint. This is what they're swimming. Exactly. They're swimming. You can see the water here. You're actually looking at a contingent of Assyrian frogmen who are swimming across a river or a moat to attack a city. They're being covered by archers behind them, who apparently are up in the mountains. And you can actually see they're using inflatable skins that they have, that are connected to their mouths to make their way and float across the series of the river to attack this city. So pretty innovative. There's actually been some debate about this, not too serious. We think that these are airbags that they use to float. Others have thought that this was the first example of scuba diving. So you would actually go underwater and use these as breathing apparatus. And in fact, I think there's a show, History's Mysteries, that did a reconstruction of this, and they got a Navy SEAL to actually go underwater with a bag filled with air, like a skin bag, and he tried to use it, and I don't think it was very successful. If I can find the clip, I'll bring it in. I did see it, and I was like, oh, that's great. So probably not scuba gear, but these guys are, again, floating across a moat or a river to attack a city. Indeed, these depictions of the sacking of cities and also what happens to those who resist are pretty graphic and just clearly laid out. You can see here examples of what Ashur-nasirpal actually was talking about: the flaying of a human being, his arm being cut, these piles of heads and ears shown not just in text but also shown in the imagery itself. And I'm not saying this didn't happen, but also the Assyrians have a vested interest in showing themselves to be brutal. That said, the truth was probably somewhere in between. Clearly this is propaganda and doesn't necessarily mean that the Assyrians were ruthless, barbaric, horrible people. But certainly this is how they're depicting themselves in this propaganda. We have the king, of course, being central in battle, much larger than everyone else in the scene. In this case, right, coming in on a chariot. Again, bigger than everybody else, bigger than life, but not quite Egyptian in the sense that he's not by himself. At least he has a team of charioteers to drive his horses for him. So it's a little more realistic than Egyptian depictions, where you have the king both riding in a chariot and shooting at the same time. That said, again, still a lot of experimentation with this new way of depicting things. These new orthostats, which again are almost permanent paintings, right, that you're putting around your throne room. You can see that in this scene too. Dimensions are still difficult, right? Just like the lamassu with those 5 legs, how do you go about depicting the king shooting a bow and arrow and not have, say, the arrow cut right across his face? That's the last thing that you would want to do, is just have this go right across the king's face. So you can see here the bowstring actually goes behind his head and around the side, which makes it very strange, because if this was actually realistic, he would let go of the string and snap himself in the back of the neck. So again, another example of Assyrian artists experimenting and figuring out this new form of depiction. We can see actually the king is paralleled by this flying sun disk. This is the god Shamash, who's taking part in the battle, symbolically backing up the king. More examples of these battles done in great detail. Again, here's Ashur-nasirpal II being assisted by a shield bearer, and all these different approaches to the sacking of a city. We see the city being defended by archers, but Assyrian troops knocking down the walls with spears in this case. Assyrian sappers digging under the walls, handing these chunks of brick as they tunnel under to take the city. Just a tremendous amount of detail of attack, counterattack.